With hate crimes on the rise across the West, recent debates around free speech have become all the more pressing. From arguments in the US about whether white supremacists should be given platforms to say bigoted things, to claims that free speech is under attack at universities, the issue has been hotly debated and politicized. So while freedom of expression is one of the backbones of democracy, should it be protected no matter what, even if it means defending so-called hate speech? And can governments even be trusted to defend both minorities and civil liberties? To debate these questions, I'm joined from Rio de Janeiro by Glenn Greenwald, journalist, lawyer, author, and co-founder of The Intercept, and in New York by Stanley Fish, a US legal scholar and public intellectual, and author of the book There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too. Thank you both for joining me on UpFront. Glenn, let me start with you. Most people would agree that free speech is integral to democracy and should be defended as much as possible. But does that really mean that we also have to protect the rights of racists, Islamophobes, anti-Semites, homophobes, misogynists, to spread some pretty poisonous and hate-filled ideas? Isn't that a misunderstanding, a distortion even, of what free speech is supposed to be about?
No, quite the opposite. First of all, the minute that you start empowering state institutions or government officials to punish people or to imprison people or to bar them from expressing certain ideas because the majority or the government dislikes those ideas, you no longer have free speech in any meaningful sense. All you have is a society in which the ideas that the government or the majority approves of are the ones that are permitted to be expressed, and all the other ones can send you to prison or get you fined or otherwise punished. Secondly, I think it's a really important truth to recognize that just as a matter of pragmatism, there's no such thing as banning ideas. It has never worked. It certainly can't work in the age of the internet. Maybe we could have an ideal world in which it's possible to ban racism and ban the expression of Islamophobia. The opposite is true, though. When you try and do it, you turn them into martyrs. You actually make them stronger. I used to represent racists, and they loved when people tried to censor them because nothing made them stronger. And then thirdly, it's astonishing to me that anybody would trust any government, let alone, say, the Trump administration or the Jeff Sessions-led Department of Justice, to decide what is and isn't hate speech. But I don't know of any governments that I would trust to make that decision.
Stanley Fish in New York, listening to Glenn there. Just pick up on a couple of those points. Glenn is saying that you can't really have any kind of free speech if government's allowed to censor that speech, and that racists kind of like being censored because it empowers them. What's your response to those 2 points?
I don't disagree with much of what Glenn said, but my take on the entire question, I think, is a bit different from his. For me, the real question is whether you regard freedom of speech as a principle or whether you regard it as a value. The difference is, if it's a principle, it's freestanding and is in some sense its own justification, and it's held to apply in almost all, if not all, circumstances. If, on the other hand, free speech is a value, then it's a value in competition with or in a mix with other values, and you ask other kinds of empirical questions. In free speech cases, what you have to do is first calculate the costs of regulating the speech in question, emotional, political, economic costs, and then calculate the costs of allowing the speech to flourish, add up the columns, see which costs more, and make your decision accordingly. I would go by that balancing idea rather than any kind of principle.
Glenn, what's wrong with balancing these different values?
Well, first of all, it's an incredibly subjective assessment. So again, in general, it's not by definition marginalized groups who end up in power and making these decisions. And in fact, if you look at the people whose free speech rights have been attacked, it hasn't overwhelmingly been racist or Islamophobes or immigration extremists in the United States and Western Europe. It's been the very marginalized groups who are cited as the reason we need censorship in the first place. It's been people who advocate a boycott of Israel. It's been people who advocate all kinds of extreme racial egalitarianism views or theories of gender equality or LGBTs. By definition, marginalized people are the most vulnerable to those determinations being made against them, not in their favor. And I just can't imagine why we would want to have lists of ideas that you're literally not allowed to express upon pain of going to jail or otherwise being punished by the state, because those calculations are so likely to be made in bad ways.
Before I go back to Stanley and get him to respond to you, just one quick thing. There's other ways of restricting free speech. For example, at a university, no platforming, saying we don't want this speaker at our university because it does conflict with our other values. We don't want to look like we're endorsing his hate-filled views or her hate-filled views. That's saying we don't want you to speak at our institution. And people say, well, that's an attack on free speech. Do you at least understand why an institution might want to do that?
Sure. I think in an academic institution, though, you can say, well, private companies have the right. If you're Twitter, you have the right to say, I don't want these views being expressed on my forum. I think academic institutions, the nature of them ought to be uniquely to encourage free inquiry and free discourse. And that's the last place we ought to want ideas being deemed off limits or restricted.
Stanley, do you want to respond to Glenn, specifically his point about how can you trust a government to regulate what is good speech, bad speech, hate speech, non-hate speech?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I'm glad that Glenn has raised it. People on his side of the street believe that the marketplace of ideas allowed to operate freely will in fact produce judgments that are sounder or less partisan than the judgment of either legislatures or courts. That if bad ideas are allowed to flourish in the air, then rational debate and deliberation by rational persons will expose their deficiencies and they will wither and die. The only argument that I find against that is all of recorded history. It never happens that way. And in fact, if you allow, for example, Holocaust denial to flourish, the result will not be that people will see the absurdity, incoherence, and evil of the idea. In fact, people who had never thought of it will say, oh yeah, and will become adherents to the army of Holocaust deniers.
Glenn?
I'm kind of astonished to hear what Stanley just said, because the history that I'm aware of teaches exactly the opposite lesson. So look at the racial progress that the United States made throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century, led by people like Martin Luther King. That progress wasn't made because racism was declared illegal to express, nor because it was denied a platform. It was because Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders were able to persuade and appeal to people's consciences that that kind of thinking is evil, destructive, toxic, and wrong. And you see that over and over. If you look at the Charlottesville protesters, the neo-Nazis, letting them march repulsed the entire country. And the next event that they tried to hold in Boston, 50 of them showed up, and 30,000 protesters showed up against them because everybody heard their ideas and were sickened by them. And that is a much more effective way to defeat horrible ideas than trying to empower the government to forcibly suppress it.
Stanley?
I continue to think that all of this talk about free speech puts too much value, either positive and negative, on the act. Speaking freely or producing certain forms of speech is in some contexts useful and in some contexts not. Now, as far as universities go, universities have nothing to do with free speech. The reigning value in universities is freedom of inquiry, and freedom of inquiry involves the censoring and vetting of views. The entire college and university system is a system of exclusion in which many more people are disallowed in the speech forum than are allowed. So I simply repeat what I said before, including political context. Freedom of speech is a value, not a principle, and it's a value of which we must ask the question in any context, is it worth it, and what's on the other side if we allow it fully to flourish?
That is a perfect formula for authoritarianism and tyranny. And I don't mean to use hyperbole, but if you look at any regimes around the world, in Egypt, in Iran, throughout Asia, throughout South America, and you look at what dictatorships have done in imprisoning dissidents and in rendering off limits any kind of political speech that they find threatening, what Stanley just said is the exact rationale that they use. We can't allow this speech because it's disruptive, it's subversive, it's harmful, and the harms of allowing this speech outweigh the values of it. I don't trust any institution or any government to apply that reasoning in a way that will be anything other than destructive. The far better and healthier way is to say, there are no ideas that can send you to prison or subject you to punishment for advocating or expressing.
Glenn, Stanley, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining me on UpFront.